Hello, welcome to CivilNet. My guests today in the studio are Daniel Mazmanian, Mehranian, and Frank Zerunyan. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting us.
After that short introduction, I'd like to give you a proper introduction, if I may. Frank Zerunyan, you are a professor of the practice of governance, the USC Price School of Public Policy, and you are also the mayor of Rolling Hills.
Rolling Hills Estates.
Mehranian, you are the managing partner of Cordoba Corporation and a member of the Water Quality Control Board. And Daniel Mazmanian, professor of public policy at the Schwarzenegger School of...
The Arnold Schwarzenegger Institute of State and Local Government.
At USC,
yes,
in California. Now, our viewers may wonder why I'm interviewing the three of you together. You are all here to participate at a conference organized by UNDP, UNDESA, a high-level workshop on governance and sustainable development. Frank, your specialty is in governance. And this is not your first time in Armenia, first time participating in such a conference that's being in Armenia?
In Armenia, yes. But this is my actual fourth conference with the United Nations on the topic of governance. I participate in conferences in Bahrain, Addis Ababa, Seoul, Korea, and now Yerevan. And
what will you be talking about at the conference?
My topic is collaborative governance. I talk about the interaction of the three sectors in managing civil society and the importance of each sector to each other. We have evolved from government as we know it. We don't no longer talk about government, we talk about governance.
And what is the difference?
The difference is that governance is in fact the interaction of these three sectors to advance society. Government alone is not capable of responding to the needs of our society today. Alibi to the technology that you're using here today. Government is not the best when it comes to, for example, broadcasting. Or government may not be the best at installing windmills or solar energy panels, but the private sector might be. And governance, as we speak about, is all about the interaction of these sectors to make not only the interaction, but also the way to deliver and implement various policies more useful for society and more efficient for society and more effective for society.
Certainly lessons that a lot of the newly emerging countries of the post-Soviet world can learn from about good governance, transparency, civic engagement, engaging with civil society, listening to the diverse voices who have something to say about any kind of public policy or action.
Well, I'm not an expert in former Soviet republics or their governance. I do know that the UN is particularly interested in reaching out to what they call least developed countries. Not that Armenia is one of them, thank God. But there are about 48 of them, and they're in the world. And about 30 to 33 of them are in Africa. And the last conference I was in Addis Ababa brought all of those African countries in trying to get them to focus on governance and to try to see how they can decentralize and bring government closer to the public with a new set of toolbox to deal with the needs of their society.
Okay. Now, Dan, where Frank leaves off, your sort of topic begins in terms of sustainable development. What will you be presenting, or will it be a follow-up or a complement to governance issues?
Well, it's an example of one of the kind of challenges we're all facing that requires thinking differently about governance, about the public and private sector, and about their working together. It happens to be a global challenge of climate change. And that is a challenge not only to specific governments, but to the international community, which is why the UN focuses extensively on this issue of sustainability and climate change. What I'm bringing to this particular conference is, rather than the normal admonitions of one should do better or do differently, an illustration of a state in the United States, California, that has gone against the conventional wisdom that's saying we can have good governance, we can transform our economy, particularly our energy system, which I will be talking about, while we still have economic growth, jobs and investment in the state. So it's one model of leading through example.
Maria, help me to understand, if you will. You are a member of the Water Quality Control Board. You are an engineer by training, yes?
Urban planner.
Urban planner. What is your role in this? How do we connect all the dots here?
As an urban planner and as a person that wears both private sector hat and is working as a regulator, volunteering as a regulator, I get the opportunity to see how good public policy translates into sustainable infrastructure. So, and you start seeing the process that in order to build infrastructure that is sustainable, being that water, being that transportation, being that housing, any kind of urban or rural development, has to do with developing policy that brings into account the issues that Dan talked about, global warming and challenges that the international community faces today. So it's not one day that we wake up and we decide that this material that we use is better for the environment, but it's how we develop legislation and regulations that promotes and is conducive of sustainable infrastructure development.
Right. My question might sound redundant, but I want to ask it taking into consideration where we are today, which is in Armenia. When you develop legislation or policy as a regulator, does public opinion or public discourse, discussion come into play when you are developing any kind of legislation or regulation?
It is actually a very good question, because in order to bring about this kind of change that we're talking about, so much of it is there out in the public, and a process of consensus. There's a huge public process. Any regulation that you pass, you need to get the consensus of the communities that are going to be subject to this regulation.
Will be affected by it.
And they are the best people who know so much of this stuff that we know technically, but what is the reality of these communities, what they can and can't do, and how would they develop themselves, and how do they need to tailor make this regulation to their own possibilities, to their own reality, in order to comply with it. Therefore, they play such a big role in the developing and in the composition of this regulation, and therefore the ways of implementing it. And that's where you have, in my mind, it's the legislators, it's the public sector with their rules and regulations, because the legislation translates into regulations. And then you have the environmental group, the NGOs, the public, the larger public. So the process of public participation, and then comes in the private sector in order to take the process from a good public policy to sustainable development.
Right.
Could I add to that? Sure. What we're talking about here is, I think, a dynamic process. And it's about learning. It's about learning both what policy advocates, I'm that in part as a professor, arguing that we should do A versus B, and a legislator dealing with a political reality of that, and then those who are asked to manage it in the, for instance, in the private sector, if it's economic development or infrastructure. We're asking all of those people to learn together, while we're asking those who are actually making the difference, the people in our society, we're asking them to change their behaviors. And you can't really impose all of that, especially with these huge issues facing all of us today. Climate change, as I say, one example, but there are many others. So how do you create this organic change in society? And I think that's what the new governance is focusing on. Not how you create a hierarchical government or how you have a separate public-private sector, but in fact how you can organically change together toward these goals we are setting for ourselves to transform.
Frank, now coming back to the conference that you will all be participating in, who are the stakeholders? Who will be participating, and what purpose is it going to be serving? Is it open to the public, or is it for policymakers? Is it for government officials? And what do you hope to impart?
Typically, to these conferences, my experience has been over the over the three that I've seen, and the fourth one coming up, obviously, but to this one, as I understand, about 20 countries, most of them former Soviet Republic countries, have been invited and will be here. Typically, we see about, out of the 20, I'd be surprised if I saw more than 6 minister level individuals. So we may see public administration ministers from various countries. In my previous conferences, I have seen, and they've been in my classes, sitting and talking and interacting, certainly. Aside from the ministers themselves, you have deputy ministers, you have senior level staff that typically participate, but they're mostly government type individuals. They are not the public, and they are not, although there are participation from sometimes the private sector, those individuals typically are either presenting something or are part of a project that the UN is promoting or participating in a conference with. I remember, for example, in one of the conferences, Peru was presenting a project in identifying children from birth because they had a big issue about losing children somehow in the process to various, whether it was sex trades or trafficking, etc. They talked about a project, so the private sector was involved in the process from a technical standpoint with the government. So you have people like that involved in these conferences, but typically is geared towards the government sector and public administrators.
Capacity building among the public sector.
Does it work? Do these conferences work when we have American-based professors, experts, specialists in the field who are taking part in a conference in a country that has a very different sort of narrative, historical, cultural. Obviously, you bring your expertise and your work experience and your knowledge to the table and hope that the person sitting on the opposite side of the table takes something away from it. But is it useful? I mean,
it's a fair question. Yeah. Of course, we have to ask the United Nations that. But it's a fair question to ask. And,
from your experience.
And from my experience, not just UN, but other international forums, what you really hope to do is spark that interest and lay out examples that they can imagine in their own society, which is not easy. And so that really it's not a one-time interaction that leads to transformation. It's a building block. It's actually the education of those who are leading, which is not a new idea at all.
I just wanted to add to what Dan said. I think these ministers and these policymakers, whoever come to these meetings, need certain kind of education. And these kind of conferences, I think, gives them this awareness about these issues. So it's an outlet. If we're sure we're not talking to ourselves, it's important to make sure that these people have you have an outlet to reach out to people who are really actually decision makers. And by giving them this kind of awareness, education, consciousness about the issue, you're hoping that this is going to be a part of their implementing processes that they're going through.
And also, I want to emphasize that we're not alone by coming from the United States. In other words, there are professors from Berlin and other practitioners from other countries that participate to this also. And understand that, you know, we come to this with all the level of humility just because we come from perhaps a relatively advanced democracy, and I'm not apologetic to that. And that does not mean that what we know to be the case for us is automatically the case for someone else. So we come to this with all the humility that we can bring to it. And your question is a very good one because, frankly, what we talk about, even the case studies we do provide them. In the workshops that I lead, for example, I make them work. I put them in groups.
Hence the name workshop,
right? I put them in groups. I give them case studies to work on based on the theory and practice that I talked about, and they do work. But the implementation, and I'm sure that that's what you're leading to, cannot happen without leadership. And the leadership cannot come from the United States, cannot come from Germany, cannot come from anywhere else. It has to come from the country that this person is in the class talking about the topic. So that's why I do speak, when I talk about collaborative governance, the last piece of my discussion is about facilitative leadership. And hopefully I can talk about the literature, I can talk about the practice of who a facilitator is and what a leader does, and the rest is really up to them.
It's about bearing responsibility, good leadership, transparent leadership, good governance. Thank you very much for this very fascinating talk. Thank you for coming.
Welcome.
I hope you have a very successful high-level workshop, and hopefully it will make a difference sometime, somewhere along the line.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
Hopefully sooner rather than later.
Hopefully. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to remind our viewers that my guests were USC professors Daniel Mazmanian and Frank Zerunyan and Maria Mehranian. Stay with CivilNet.